In this video, I'm going to sew a tunic from the Tunic Bible. If you are one of the many people who purchased this book when it was published in 2016, and you have not yet sewn a tunic from the Tunic Bible, I invite you to sew along with me. Welcome to my channel. I'm Janine. In this video, we are going to use the Tunic Bible written by Sarah Gunn and Julie Starr, and we're going to make a tunic. I bought this book in 2016 when it was first released, flipped through it, looked at the pretty pictures, and then set it aside. I've now used this book to make this tunic, and I sewed tunics with several sewing friends, and we all had the same comment about using the Tunic Bible. While the pattern is great, and there are lots of beautiful inspirational photos and ideas for embellishing a tunic, the pattern instructions aren't laid out in the way that any of us are used to. You have to thumb through the book to get to different sections in order to complete next steps. Since I knew I wanted to make a second version of the tunic, I decided to record this Sew With Me. So if you have the Tunic Bible, I hope that you will sew a tunic with me today. This is not really a complicated pattern. If you want to add a bunch of embellishments, you can make it much more complex, but I'm going to sew a fairly basic tunic and record the steps as I go along. There are chapters down below if you would like to skip to something, skip forward, or skip back. I'm going to do my best to record this video so it's easy for you to follow, but I am not going to be recording several minutes of the sewing machine running. This is really guidepost and steps for you to take, and I hope it's enjoyable. So let's sew a tunic. Here we are, the Tunic Bible, written by Sarah Gunn and Julie Starr. Start off selecting your size. This pattern is not size inclusive. For reference, I normally sew an 18 or a 20 in Big 4, and I do an FBA. I selected an XL, and I made some modifications. So check your body measurements and confirm them against the finished garment measurements and select your size. Then you need to get fabric. For my size, I've got 1.6 meters of fabric, and today I am using just one fabric. I'm not using a contrast element for anything. So I have 1.6 meters of fabric and 0.5 meter of fusible interfacing. I am using a lightweight woven fabric today. Now you need to cut out the pattern pieces, but you have to trace them first. The pattern pieces are in the back of the book. They're perforated. Pull them out, and then you need to trace off the pattern pieces because the patterns printed on both sides of the paper. So you cannot just cut out the pattern pieces. I made a toile the first time around and made several adjustments to that, and I've also made a couple of changes since I made my last version. So this is the front bodice piece, and the adjustments that I made is lowering the bust apex, and then I did kind of a cheat grade out on this. I know this isn't the way you're supposed to do it, but this worked just fine. I added just about, it was about 1 centimeter, 3/8, maybe 1/2 inch along the sides, starting below the armhole, and just gave myself a little bit of extra breathing room. Did that on the front and on the back. Also added the little bit there. The other changes I made on the back, so I did a sway back adjustment here, And since I made my previous version, I've since done a high round back adjustment. On the sleeve is designed to be bracelet length, I believe, so it was just too short for me. So I've actually added 3 inches of length to the sleeve. If it's too long when I sew this up, I'll just have a little bit deeper hem on the sleeve. The only other piece that we need today is the elongated placket. I've made no changes to this. So we have 4 pattern pieces: front bodice, back bodice, sleeve, and the placket. Here's the layout that I used, and I've put the fabric requirements for my XL size on the top. I brought the selvages into the center and was able to cut the front and the back on the fold. Then I folded the fabric back out and did the usual selvage to selvage fold, cut 2 sleeves, mirror images of course, and 1 placket. There's also a placket cut from fusible interfacing. Almost forgot something. We need to cut some bias tape for the neckband. You can use purchased bias tape if you like. I am going to try to squeeze out enough bias tape for this top, and I'm using the lines on my table to cut. I will need about 22 inches. Sorry, this is reflecting right there. I'll need about 22 inches, and I want to cut this tape. I kind of like it 2.5 inches wide, but you pick whatever you prefer. This is the selvage edge up at the top here. The neck, this has to fit around the neck edge with a little bit for overlap. Neck edge on for my size is about 20 inches. So I am going to try and see if I can get 22 inches. Well, we've got a visitor here. Have to remove the kitty since there's a bleed here. So I will cut this 2 3/4. And just in case I have not calculated right, I'm going to cut another strip as well. This is kind of my, gosh, what did I screw up piece. So I'll cut another piece. So I've got a little bit more. So I will, this is my backup piece. This, let's see here, how long is this going to be? Got 24 inches, so I should be fine. I will now press this. I'm first pressing it in half, and then I'll press it in half again. Just set that aside now until we need it. Now on the front, we'll mark the bust dart, and then we also have to thread trace the center front line. That's the most important marking that we have to do. If I screw up anything else, it's not a big deal. If I screw that up, it is a big deal. So when I take this off for marking the bust line, I am going to pin the front together so the fold is maintained. The next step is to thread trace the center front. And we thread trace it so that we can be certain that we have the placket aligned in the middle, and also thread tracing, like basting, doesn't disappear while markings, just regular markers, will. When I thread trace and when I do basting, hand basting, I use this Japanese basting thread that you can find in different fabric stores and notions places. The benefit of it is that it breaks really easily, and it's really rough, so it comes out easily. I will just do a long basting stitch right along the fold here. And you want to continue this down far enough that it will be to the bottom of the placket. So that's several inches. There we go, that's long enough. So here we can see the center front is right there. The yellow stitches. It's easier to see in the back. But now we have the center front line done. On the back bodice, I'm using the darted version. So I have to put the darts, the one dart in, and then also I adjusted this with a high round back. So I have to put in a mark for that dart as well. For this, I'm just going to use chalk. I'm not great at marking. I know some people are very diligent about using tailor's tacks. I sometimes take the easy way out, and I am going to be taking the easy way out here. So I have put pins in where I need to mark. Just going to chalk there. We're ready to sew, but before we do that, it's worth taking a second to think about how you're going to finish your seams so that you can make the inside look as nice as the outside. In the Tunic Bible, they suggest either using French seams, a serger, or pinking shears. I'm going to be sewing all the seams on my sewing machine, and then I'll be cleaning up the seam allowances with my serger. If you decide that you want to do French seams, you'll need to make the necessary adjustments to how you sew the seams so that you have French seams. And if you want to use pinking shears, then you can finish using pinking shears at the same time that I'm using the serger. The first step is to stay stitch the necks of the front and the back bodice. So let's start sewing. Because I have created darts for the high round back adjustment, I'm going to stitch those now so that they are done before I start dealing with the shoulders and the neck. I'll just press these darts and then we're going to work on the placket. We're now going to work on the most fiddly part of the tunic. We get the hard part out of the way first. The next step is to interface the placket, cut a piece of fusible interfacing, and just press it to the wrong side of the placket. When you are marking the placket now, please don't use a Frixion pen because you will be pressing this. And secondly, I forgot to tell you that you should thread trace the center line after you've finished all of your other markings, because it will really help you align the placket to the bodice. Now we need to mark the placket. And this is your interface placket piece. Get your pattern piece. When you first cut out the pattern, if you did not snip these 3 notches, the center line and the 2 stitching lines at the top, snip those now. Put your pattern piece back down and snip those now. You will also need to mark the bottom line, the bottom of the stitching line. So mark that with chalk or with your Frixion pen. Then take a long ruler and draw the center line, which is between the middle snip, the center line snip, and the point. Just draw that with chalk or with a Frixion pen, whichever you prefer. The next 2 lines that we need to draw, this here, that's the bottom of the stitching that we just marked, and up at the top, so stitching line, center line. Wrong side of the placket up. Of course, it's been interfaced and we've already marked it. We will now turn in the outside edges and press them, and then we're going to finish them by stitching. So you can measure if you want. I just turn them in about 1/2 inch. And my fabric, of course, presses really nicely. And you don't do the top, you don't do this section, but you do the point. Now this, you'll want to try to get the bottom point aligned. So I've just lined this up with the line on my pressing pad. And now I'll go to the machine and I'm going to stitch to hold the edges in place. We have the placket and we have the front bodice. And on both, the center lines have been traced. Unfortunately, you can't see the yellow as well as I can, but my thread tracing line is here. Align the front bodice with the placket, right sides together, so the center lines, the center traced lines match. Take your time, use lots of pins, and how I will do this is I will put a pin straight down the line, and then I'm going to flip it over because I'll be able to see the thread traced center line better on the back and make sure it's aligned. I didn't think about how this was going to show up on a camera when I picked out this pretty fabric. So I have put pins down the front, and now I will check to see how well the pins aligned with the thread traced line, and they have pretty well. The only place where they don't align is where my thread tracing was not perfectly straight, like where it kind of zigzagged. Now we will be stitching this, so I cannot leave the pins like this. I'm going to put in a whole bunch of pins in such a way that I will be able to stitch. I will also mark the bottom of the cut line for the placket. So this is the point right here where we're going to be cutting. So it's not going to be that deep. This placket is the opening is not really low. It's not indecent. Now I'm going to baste down that line on the machine. So I switched my machine to a basting stitch, and we'll just baste down the yellow center line. Although I'm at the point now where the cut for the placket is going to end, I'm just going to do a few extra stitches to be sure I have this in line. Now that this is basted, our next step will be to stitch down the blue lines. Let's zoom in so you can see it a little bit better. We will be stitching on these blue lines down to the bottom, and then we will be cutting it afterwards. So you want to make sure that you are happy with this placement. When I'm stitching things like this, I will shorten the stitch as I get closer to the end, and then also down here at the very end. Not too short, if I normally stitch this at 2.5, I might change it to 2. If you have too short of a stitch, then you know that it can be impossible to unpick, and hopefully you won't have to unpick. But just take your time and stitch along those lines, and also at the end, there are just a few stitches there. Again, just take your time, make sure everything's flat. Just going to shorten the stitch a tad. Turn. One, 2, 3, 4 stitches. Again, just make sure everything's nice and flat and you're feeling comfortable with it. And lengthen the stitch again. This is now stitched. I'll zoom in so you can see it. Here's the basting stitch in the center, and then our 2 rows of stitching. So we are going to cut. Don't get too close to the bottom. Just cut down the middle. Again, take your time. Don't get too close to the bottom there, but I am clipping in a little bit to the corners. So now, here we go. The next step is to understitch as far as you can. So let's give this a quick press, and then we will understitch as far as we can on here. Now that that's pressed, I'll just take this to the machine and understitch. Before we finish the neck, we need to have the shoulders sewn together. I have placed the back bodice here, face up, And now I'm taking the front bodice and I'm matching the shoulder seams together. You may recall that I'm doing a high round back adjustment on my tunic. So just before this point, I stitched the darts into the back bodice on the shoulders there. And these will be stitched on the machine. And then I'll be finishing that seam allowance. This is the first actual seam that we've sewn. So we're going to set the machine to a regular stitch, which for me is 2.5 millimeter stitch. And all seam allowances are 5/8 of an inch. We will be sewing the shoulder seams. I want to make sure I get my seam allowances right. Because I switch between machines, sometimes I wind up with seam allowances in the wrong place. There we go. I'll press these and then we're going to finish the seam allowances. I'll be serging within the seam allowance. I'm not going to serge right up to the edge of the seam. The next step is to finish the neck edge, and it is finished primarily with the bias tape that we made previously. Of course, we have the front and back stitched together at the shoulders, and that shoulder seam has been finished. We have the bias tape that we made previously, so just find about the center of it. Mark it. We'll start in the center back and right sides together. Stitch, pin the bias tape around the neckband. Don't make it too tight. Don't make it tight at all. Actually, don't make the bias tape tight at all, because you want a little bit of ease to it for going around the curve. And here we are at the edge of the placket. Overlap the bias tape over the edge of the placket about an inch. And the other side here. And we'll do the same thing on this side. We'll overlap the bias onto the placket by about an inch. Now we'll go to the sewing machine and stitch just inside of the pressed line. Again, I am starting, so the bias tape is overlapping the placket by about an inch. And I will sew very close to or right on the fold using just my regular stitch, which is 2.5 millimeter. And I will be back stitching here. And stopping about an inch from the edge of the placket again. So bias tape is attached around the neck. So I have stopped stitching. Just to clarify what I'm going to show you, we have stopped stitching when the bias tape overlapped the folded over placket by about an inch, but we have not yet sewn closed the top of the placket. And that's what we are going to do now. An inch in, but what I need to do is continue stitching because this is just basted. This is one of the places where the instructions are a little bit confusing. So let's cut off the excess bias tape on both ends. And I will continue stitching from where I stopped here and just go to the edge so that I'm actually stitching the top of the placket. And that will wind up being a 5/8 inch seam allowance. We'll do the same thing on the other end. So the next step is going to be turning this inside out. And then when we turn that, you can see the bias tape is all going to be turned to the inside. So we'll clean this up. Trim that corner. Oh, these are little extra threads. Tap your point turner. Gently. All sorts of random threads here. Just we have basting stitches. And now we're going to go and press all of this. Now we will press, turning the placket to the inside and the bias to the inside. Let's start at the edge where I've turned the placket to the inside. And then I will work my way around, pressing the bias tape to the inside. Make sure that the outside is favored so you don't see the bias tape. Of course, we haven't stitched it yet, so if something shows a little bit, you've still got time to sort it out. And press open your placket. And your placket at the bottom should be opened without any creases. If you know that you stitched it right and it's bunched up a little bit, just open it up and see if you can trim a little bit closer to the stitching without cutting the stitching. Now this is what the front looks like now. It's open. Our next step is going to be to top stitch this. And the instructions are to also top stitch the placket down to the bodice. So I'll pin all of this carefully and then we'll take a look at it before we stitch it. Now you can see the front placket that is open. And what we are instructed to do is top stitch so that we're catching the edge of the placket. And the edge of the placket is pretty big. It goes all the way down to here. So you can choose to not do that if you like. I am going to try. And I have set my long ruler under here so that I know I'm keeping it flat, and will be pinning along the edge. Of where I will be stitching. And again, if you don't do this, it just means I did not do this in my other version. I didn't want to, I didn't think it would work well because my previous version was made out of corduroy. So I did not do this, and it just means that the placket can possibly move around some. But on this, I'm going to try and top stitch it. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. So I'm putting the pins in where I can feel that they are at the edge. And trying to keep this very flat, which is why it helps to have something solid, non-fabric underneath. You could use a different color thread for this if you like. Because I'm not feeling completely confident about how well how perfectly this is going to be lined up, I'm just going to use my blue thread that shouldn't show much. I'll now take this to the sewing machine and I will be top stitching around the front and then around all the way around the neckband. Now, one thing I almost forgot to mention. If you're planning to add a label, now is the time. Underneath the tape so that it's caught when you're top stitching. And I'm going to do that. So I will find the center here, very unscientifically, by folding it in half. I'm going to put 2 labels. So I'll just pin those in using 2 pins. All right, now we're off to the sewing machine. I've set my machine so that it will be, so that I have aligned it so it should be stitching well within the bias tape. And I'm using a length of 3 because I like that for top stitching. I will sew the neckband first and then I'll do the placket. And I'm not going to backstitch. I will just do a catch stitch and then I'll tie off the threads. Now I will stitch, hopefully, catch the edge of the placket all the way down. Keeping this flat and feeling the edge of the placket. Let's hope that worked. Okay, let's give this a press. Well, I caught something there, but it's not terrible. I'm not going to worry about it. Have to trim some threads, but the front placket is now done. And now we get to move on to the easy stuff. I'll just pull these threads through and trim them, and then we are going to do the side seams. I jumped ahead of myself when I said we were going to do the side seams. Next, we will do the bust darts and the darts in the back. Fortunately, I can see the markings for my bust darts. My back darts I'm going to have more problems with. So here is the apex. Before I actually sew these, I'm going to make sure these are even. Now the back darts. All right, I'm going to go sew all these. Sewing bust darts first. And I use, a lot of you probably do the same thing, I use a piece of thread as a guide. Same thing. And the back darts. Front and back darts all stitched. They just need a quick press. Quick press of the darts. I can't remember which is right, pressing back darts in or out. I am thinking they should be pressed out. That's what I'm going to do. And I'm pressing the bust darts down. Okay, moment of truth. Let's check the bust darts and see if they're pointing somewhere bad. Bust apex. Bust apex. Well, that could be a better location, but overall it's not too bad. We're going to do the side seams next. If you want to have slits on the side, now is the time to mark the fabric where you want the slits to be. Before we sew the side seams though, we are going to serge the raw edges. I'm going to serge each one separately to finish the seam allowance. Front and back, both pieces. So serging from the bottom of the arm side, just inside. We're not really taking off any fabric because we don't, we don't want to change the seam allowance. So just along the edge so we don't have any fraying. Of course, if you're doing French seams, you wouldn't do this. And if you prefer to pink your seam allowances, you could run a line of stitching now and pink the edges if you wanted, or you can do it after the seam is sewn. Okay, all four sides are now serged. The next step is to pin together the side seams, front and back. Remembering, if you want to have a slit on the side, I am going to have a slit on the side. You have to stop stitching before the slit. On the pattern, the slit is up about 4 inches. I'm going to put my slit up a little bit higher. I will have the slit probably six or so inches, maybe a little higher. I'm going to actually hold this up against my body and decide where I want to have the slit. I decided to put the slits starting 8 inches up from the bottom. So I have pinned the fronts and backs together and marked where I'm going to stop stitching. And I'll be sewing just a straight seam, regular 2.5 millimeter seam, to stitch the front and back sides together. Front and back are stitched together at the sides. Now need to press open the seams, and at the same time I will be finishing off the slits just by pressing them under twice and top stitching. Now that the side seams are sewn, I'll press them open. And where I have the slit, I'll press that back. So I will just fold it back once and do a double fold really and press it. And I will top stitch along here, across the top, and I'll reinforce that, and then back down the side for both sides. I'll now top stitch along the edges, pivot at the top, reinforce, and stitch down the other side. Of course, you could pin this if you wanted. I find that something like this, where this fabric presses so nicely, I don't really need to pin, but you can. Just because I have bad habits, it doesn't mean that you have to as well. That's just top stitched. And it's finished up at the top of the vent. So this is the vent. I'll give this a quick press, and then we're going to work on the sleeves. Now we're on to the sleeves. The first thing to do on the sleeves is serge the underarm seam. We're going to finish them the same as we did the side seams so that they can be pressed open. So I'll first serge the outside edge of each of the sleeves, side edges. Then we are going to ease in the sleeve cap. So once I've done the serging, I'm going to go over to the sewing machine and run 2 rows of basting stitches between the notches on each of the sleeves. I just serged the hem edge, which is okay because it has to be done anyway. Ding dong. The next step is to sew 2 rows of ease or gathering stitches on each of the sleeve heads. I need a tail. And I'll switch to basting stitch. Two rows of basting stitches in between the notches. Two rows of basting stitches on the sleeve head for both sleeves. Next, we will sew the underarm seam of the sleeve. So I will pin this together. I'll switch back to a regular stitch. Five-eighth inch seam. and the other sleeve. Both sleeves now sewn. I will press the seams open, and then it's time to set the sleeve in. Let's set in the sleeves. Let's see here. Wrong sleeve. Start pinning the underarm seam. I always try to get the underarm seam perfectly aligned. I am not usually successful. Always seems to be off by a stitch or two, but maybe today we'll be lucky. And I'll pin at the notches. Thread out of the way. Match the double notches. There should be a notch on the sleeve that matches the seam, the shoulder seam, and there is. And I have the shoulder seam allowance pressed to the back. And now it's a matter of easing in. There isn't a lot of easing to be done on this. A little bit. It's not a puffy sleeve by any means. Just has a little bit of ease to make it, I guess, more comfortable. I guess. I don't know. Much ease. Take some of that out. And the other side. I'll ease this side. I'll do the other side the exact same way. Second sleeve. 'Cause Did you notice that my ironing board is so beautiful? I need to get a new cover one day. Match the notches. Match the notch at the top to the shoulder. And ease this in. Before I stitch this, I'll make sure that everything looks even. All the gathering looks even. Does not look even there. And then let's sew the sleeves on. Using a regular stitch. And just sewing the sleeve. I have the sleeve against the feed dogs. One sleeve sewn, and now let's do the other one. Now I'll press the sleeve heads. Let's turn this right side out, get a look. I will now finish the seam using the serger, serging the two seam allowances together. I somehow lost all the video of this bit of serging. The seam allowances are just serged together, or you can pink them if you prefer, or if you've done a French seam, you would have done that here. I will now press the sleeves. We're really on the home stretch now. If you haven't yet tried on your tunic, I suggest that you do so you can decide the length. Now I had lengthened the sleeves, still a little too long now, better too long than too short. And this is the length that I will be hemming the sleeves. In terms of the length of the tunic, it's much too long. I don't like it this long. Personal preference. And before I hem this, I will pin it and decide a length that I like, that I prefer. The last time I made this, I shortened it by 3 inches. I may shorten this a little bit more, but I'll play around with that. I plan to use the blind hem stitch on my machine to hem, and I will start out by testing that on the sleeves to make sure that I'm happy with it. If I'm not happy with the blind hem stitch, I will likely hand hem. But we are this close to being done. My desired hem is 2 1/8 inch. So I will pin this. Now I'll give this a press. And since I will be using the blind hemmer, I'll be stitching along here. So this is how I will need to have the hem set. Now I can just fold it like this, but because I don't use the blind hemming foot very often, I'm going to pin it there. To help me know where I am sewing and where the blind hem will pop out. Okay. I'm going to try this on this first hem before I do the other side. I don't often use the blind hem foot, so fingers crossed that it works well. Select my stitch. Change the presser foot. There we go. It's difficult to do things like that with the camera right in front of your face. Remove the free arm. Okay, and where is our sleeve? Here we are. Okay. Okay, let's see how this worked. Fingers crossed. So it would be nice to not have to hand hem. Actually, yeah, that turned out pretty well. It needs a press. You can barely see some of the stitches, but I think that worked. So I will press this and then I'll press up the other side the exact same way, and we'll stitch it the same way. Let's see how this presses. I can see the stitches. However, my hand stitching abilities are absolutely abysmal. So I think even if I stitch this by hand, it would be no better than this. So I think I will use the blind stitch. Of course, I'm going to do the other sleeve, and I think I'll use the blind hem stitch for the lower hem. Bottom hem. I decided to use a 3-inch hem. It's very deep. I believe this pattern is intended to have a 1-inch hem. You select whatever hem you want to have, but I am going to have a 3-inch hem. Fortunately, there is no shaping to this hem, to the pattern pieces. It's just straight, which makes life a lot easier when you're trying to hem something. And I will use the blind hem stitch. Here on the far side, where we have the slit, I don't want that to show. Once I have the hem stitched, I will stitch this down. Can't remember if they said to do that in the book, but that's what I will do. So when we do the other side, I don't know if I just did the front or the back, make sure that your hems match on both sides of the slit. Just pin that and check it before you go to all the work of pinning everything else. There we go. That's better. Okay, quick press. And now I will fold back so I can stitch the hem. Same thing I did last time on the sleeves. This is the stuff I used to really rush through when I was younger. And then I realized that it didn't help the final product. So I may as well just take my time, listen to music, daydream, while I pin things like this. Okay, Let's go stitch this. Getting so close. This is the best part of the project. And you're almost done. And you hope you don't just screw up this last little bit. So, blind hem on the hem. One side, and now we just have to do the other side, which I have not pinned. Let's pin this quickly. Oh no, I have pinned it. Huh. Straight stitch. A little bit longer because it's going to be kind of top stitching. I want to tack down the vent where the hem is. I want to make sure that the hem doesn't show. Now, you can do this by hand. I am going to do this on the machine and stitch very close to the edge. So here's one. You can't really see the stitching. And let's do this side. And now we're at the final press. And we're done. If you haven't finished your tunic yet, I hope you're really close. I'm really pleased with how mine turned out. I like the fabric. After making adjustments twice to the pattern, I feel like it fits well. As I mentioned at the beginning, once we get past this placket, it's smooth sailing. It's a relatively easy project. Of course, you can make it more difficult by adding embellishments, but for the version that we sewed today, it's fairly straightforward. I want to give all credit to Sarah Gunn and Julie Starr for writing the book, for having the idea, the inspiration, the motivation, the gorgeous designs, the patterns, the instructions, everything is theirs. In this video, I've just put the instructions in an order that made sense to my brain, so it was easier for me to follow along and sew. If you have sewed along, I hope this was helpful to you. I'll say that this video was way more challenging to make than I thought it would be. All of the different camera angles that are needed, having different cameras set up in different places, the sewing machine, the cutting table, the ironing board. And you all now know that I need a new cover for my ironing board. It was challenging. It was fun. I hope that the way that I've edited this, it has helped you with sewing the project. And I also really hope that I didn't make anybody sick by jumping between cameras too quickly. Anyway, if you sewed with me, thanks so much. I'd love to hear about your project. If you're still thinking about it, maybe this will help you in the future. Again, thank you for watching. I hope to see you again soon.